Thanks everyone for having me. So, as it was said, I am a threat detection engineer assistant. I've been for a little over 2 years now. Before I was in threat intelligence. So overall, I've been in the cybersecurity space around 4 or 5 years, and yeah, it's been a very nice journey, especially focusing on Linux malware, which doesn't always get the same spotlight as Windows. So it's definitely been a really cool thing. Be sure to check out the SysDig blog as well for more Linux and cloud threats if this is something you're interested in. So for this talk, the main agenda will be trying to build an actor profile for UNC5174, which is a moniker for a threat actor that was first discovered by Mandiant in 2024. And it's supposed to be like a Chinese state-linked / aligned party. We're going to be looking at recent campaigns in terms of the 2024 one from Mandiant briefly for the introduction, since they did a pretty good job in building actor profile themselves, and then the campaign that we've seen at SysDig in early 2025. And we're going to be talking about techniques specifically, so with the MITRE ATT&CK framework, in case it is helpful. It is a very good way to try to rationalize the techniques that we see with these actors. And we're going to be talking about attribution challenges because in this case, the main focus is that this actor has been using open source tools, which anyone can use. So the idea is that it is challenging to know whether you're being targeted by somebody like them or it's an isolated incident. So we're going to be trying to look at some ways that defenders can actually try to make that distinction. And yeah, we're going to be looking at some defense open source tooling because open source tools are not malicious per se. They're not bad. And then we're going to have a Q&A in case there are any questions. Yeah. You can't hear me? Okay. Maybe I'll just try to hold it. Is this better? Okay. Perfect. Okay, so as I said, it was first discovered in 2024 by Mandiant, and the research highlighted well, basically in terms of attribution and intelligence, who the main targets were, which are Western government organization and research institutions, and think tanks, for example, and NGOs, basically Western targets that could be of interest to a Chinese state-aligned threat actor. And they mainly target Linux-based systems. Not sure why. They probably are just more skilled in Linux, which we will see because they definitely are. Their main goal is to resell the access that they acquire to compromise infrastructure to Chinese state-interested parties. So in this case, we've seen them act as a broker for illicit access. And that's why we haven't really seen any post-exploitation activities once they land on the system. They install backdoors, they remain there, remote access tools mostly. They don't try to exploit it themselves. So they just stay silent and resell the access when it's needed. And as we've said, they employ open source tools. Again, we can speculate as to why, but it is a very powerful thing for an attacker that is able to develop custom malware and is very financially skillful and resourceful to actually decide to use tools that anyone can use. We believe that this is to their advantage. We've seen pretty sophisticated techniques in this case, which are not something that we believe any threat actor with basic technical knowledge could do. And we've also seen considerable financial resources being spent on infrastructure. While we were tracking this campaign since November 2024, we've seen the first domains distributing their malicious tools. We were basically able to see that every few days there were hundreds of new domains or something like this. That is not something that anyone could be able to keep up with. So as to our campaign that we investigated. I've actually, while I was putting together this presentation, one thing that is missing here that we didn't have is this dig that Trellix had discovered in August, late August, so just, a few weeks ago, is that the main initial access vector was a phishing email with a bar archive that contained the payloads here, so the initial bash script. So that's pretty interesting because at the time we didn't really see, we weren't really able to make that assessment with the initial access vector. So this graph is not showing that for that reason. But the main initial access vector was phishing. So we have a malicious bash script that basically ended up downloading 2 executables from a remote server, which in this case was this Google with 3 O's, asia.com, nothing to do with the real Google. And it basically acted both as the main C2 and the main initial distribution vector, this remote server. So we found, I think while we were researching this, it had a dozen of subdomains and they were all used for different purposes. So that's kind of interesting that they had their own central domain. So this DNS logger is the SNOWLIGHT malware, which is a custom malware. This was named by Mandiant and identified first by Mandiant in 2024. And it is a dropper that ends up dropping a fileless payload, which in our case was VShell, and in their case it was SuperShell, which is another open source tool. And then it also downloads and executes Sliver, which is a red teaming framework as well. We believe that it was done for fallback, that the main payload is supposed to be SNOWLIGHT, but in case something doesn't work, and we'll see a little bit later why, that they would still try to rely on Sliver to have a foothold in the system. So in this case, yes, so the DNS logger doesn't have the VShell payload embedded to unpack. It has to download it with a specific GET request to the remote server. So that's quite interesting because it's kind of a dynamic execution. If there are checks in the malware to know whether to run or not. So it is going the extra mile, not to just drop traces of the final payload, which we believe is going to be the VShell one, which is fileless. And that is not a very common thing, although it has been, I think it has been documented just a few months ago that now it's starting to be used, this technique of fileless malware also for crypto mining, which is kind of interesting. Because so far, this is a pretty sophisticated technique and way of distributing malware. Not everyone's going to be able to do that. The malware was also heavily obfuscated with, I think VShell is written in Go, and the OG open source VShell one, and it was obfuscated with a few, I think it's called Go Garble, the one that obfuscates Go malware. So we had to install plugins and stuff to try to decrypt what it was actually trying to do. So yeah, basically we've seen this campaign overall going the extra mile to be sure that nothing is left, that doesn't have to run. And even when it does run, it's supposed to be very silent and very stealthy. So yeah, so these are snippets from the initial bash script that we've seen. So the main idea, yes, is that it downloads the executables from the remote server and then it runs them. It makes a few checks, which is kind of interesting. If it is root, it will try to move them from TMP, a temporary writable directory, to user bin, and it's going to try to modify the timestamp so that we suppose for defense evasion purposes, so that, if you're auditing or you have some alerts, you're not, basically the binaries are going to match the target folder timestamps. So for example, any newly added binaries there may not be flagged. So that was quite interesting. We've also seen them use the classic cron tab for basically trying to persist on the system, because if it is not root and is in TMP, it's not a persistent storage TMP. So in this case, it's gonna be adding them to a cron tab file so that it will run every hour and it will try to run every reboot as well. So this is a way for the attackers to know that the malware is going to persist. And it also ended up using systemctl as well, which is a way to manage systemd services on Linux. And that's another persistence technique, we think, because in this case, it registered the executables as services on Linux, and then it's going to make them run in the background. So, yeah. Let's see if I forgot something. Yeah, I think that should be all for the initial bash script. So in this case, the bash script downloads this, which is SNOWLIGHT. As I pointed out, it has been named and found by Mandiant in 2024. It is very straightforward. It is a dropper. So the main purpose of this malware is to fetch the payload with a specially crafted GET request. You can see that in the send-to snippet in the slide, which is going to be basically giving some parameters to the server in order to actually get the binary back. So this is like an anti-analysis technique, because in case you're trying to connect to the remote server and try to get the binary yourself, like you're not going to be able to unless you know the parameters that the server wants before giving you the final payload. So that's definitely not something we see every day in terms of security incidents like this. So yeah, one interesting thing that we said is that it downloads the VShell payload at runtime. Like it doesn't just, unpack it. This, we believe, is not something that is usually able to be kept up with at a small scale type of incident, because if you think about it, like the C2 is R-coded. So, there could be like a point of failure in this strategy where the C2 gets taken down and that's that. Like you can't get the payload in the end. But in this case, we've seen them basically shuffling IP addresses very quickly. So, this is not, again, something that every isolated incident attacker is going to do. Like it takes a lot of effort to maintain a central infrastructure like this and considerable financial resources. So, of course, we've seen different domains being used. We'll dive into this a little bit later. But the idea is that, basically the domains and the IP addresses involved in here are in the hundreds. And this is a large scale campaign for being so. And the final thing is it retrieves the payload and then it executes it filelessly. This is a way in Linux with the mapfd create system call to execute a file that doesn't actually exist on disk. So it's backed by volatile storage. And we've seen this threat increasingly used, even by less skilled actors, but it's still not very common. So this definitely caught our eye. In this case, the binary was named kworker, which is a benign kernel process name given on Linux processes that are related to the kernel. So we'll look at the VShell binary itself. Again, this wasn't really malicious. It was developed for security purposes by a Chinese speaking person, we believe, because the GitHub repo information was in Chinese. But again, it wasn't necessarily malicious. It was used as a remote access tool. And the author himself or herself, I don't know, but they decided to take it down, basically, because as soon as it was released, it started being abused. And they expired the license of the software in a way that couldn't really be used. And the thing that is interesting from this author here is that expiring the license, I did have to poke around and try to make it run myself and there are guides basically on Telegram and on how to basically use this. And we've seen that the first guides that the software was cracked, double quote, started appearing in September 2024. And by November 2024, we started seeing VShell being used by this actor. So we can't really speculate that much on what happened, why they chose to use VShell, because as we said in 2024, they were using SuperShell, which is a very similar tool. it is possible that they did that because Mandiant exposed them. So they exposed their techniques and the open source tool. So they just found another one. Or I don't know. Another thing that we've seen on underground forums is that this VShell malware is basically being called like better than Cobalt Strike. It's very intuitive. As you can see, it has a UI. So it's not like it's a UI where you can centrally manage like your compromised systems. And from there, if you look on the side, you can choose the payload that you want to deploy through VShell. So the interesting thing here is that not only there's a backdoor, but you can continue to deliver malicious payload in the future, basically. So, and everything is through the UI in this case, so that's pretty neat, basically. Yeah, so we're going to be looking at VShell in a little more details on what we have observed during the research. So as soon as it's executed, it tries to read quite a few sensitive files on the system. We believe this is done for like reconnaissance and then basically sending back like the information about the system where it landed. One thing that was interesting is that as soon as it's executed, it allocates like huge chunks of memory, but these are not accessible. So we tested around, like, is this something that everyone does? And no, it is not. We believe that this is done on purpose because, as we said, it is possible to deploy further payloads. So in this case, we believe it maps these chunks of memory so that it can deploy further payloads once it needs to. And in this case, we didn't see it. We left it running for a few days, but we didn't really see the attacker sending us back anything. But yeah, that was a cool artifact in terms of behavioral indicator that we've seen. We've created a Falco rule, which I'm going to be sharing at the end, also shared in the blog, which basically can flag this, like, since it is not a very common behavior. So another interesting thing that is not very common is the usage of WebSockets. Well, we've seen that. I think there are like a handful of reports on malware trying to use WebSockets for C2 communication, but there weren't very many. And I believe it is like kind of tedious to set up a WebSocket compared to the classic protocols because basically it runs like on a standard port and it's also like it requires like very low overhead. So in this case, it was perfect for them because if you're trying to get like a payload as soon as possible to a system, like it's going to be very fast, and it's encrypted. So for example, like when the malware upgraded to a WebSocket, we couldn't really see anything of interest in the network traffic anymore. So it could also be a defense evasion technique in this case where, yeah. So VShell is kind of like, I would say, yeah. Yeah. So in this campaign specifically, VShell is going to be fileless, but Sliver is just deployed as is. Yeah. So, and it's going to be like, for the Sliver part, we had the analysis on it as well because it used different remote servers as well to connect and different protocols. But yeah, like in terms of, we left them running for a few days, but we didn't really see the attacker sending us back anything. So we can just speculate in this case as to why they were used and how they were used just by researching them like this. But yeah, the Sliver one was a standalone binary. And I think it wasn't really supposed to be the main payload. I think it was because in case, for example, SNOWLIGHT wasn't able to download the VShell one. But in terms of why they would choose either Sliver or VShell, in this case, like, yeah, VShell is pretty neat. Like, you can have a UI where you can see all your compromised systems, and it's also like way less common than Sliver as well, which I think, you know, if you're doing like intelligence, trying to like block Sliver, it's going to be much easier because it is way more tracked than something like VShell, which is, until we researched it, I think we've seen it used in different campaigns, which I'm not sure that they're related to the same actor, but they were used. It was used against Mac OS and Windows system as a cross-platform malware as well. So yeah, it has quite a few utilities in the sense, like it can be a backdoor, it can be a remote access tool, it can deploy shellcode on the system. So it does offer like a few functionalities. Yeah, and all of this, again, is happening like filelessly. Like there isn't really a program that you're gonna be finding on your system that's gonna be doing this. Yeah. So overall, once it upgrades the network connection to the WebSocket, then it just waits for further commands, and that's that in our case. So at this point, I think maybe a little recap with the techniques could be good, given the amount of information. So in this case, we can build the profile by looking like at the main MITRE attacks tactics that we've seen. So the motivation is not really a MITRE attack tactics, but it's a good recap. So as it was said also by the Cybersecurity Center in France, while we were researching it, we've seen a report from them while they were having the Summer Olympics. They were targeted by this actor, and they also put out their own report, and they said that it did look like looking for valuable initial access to resell. So that confirmed what Mandiant had also said on this actor. For the initial access, so we can see a mix of vectors. So what Mandiant found and what the French cybersecurity agency found was exploitation of vulnerabilities that at the time were 0 days. So they weren't patched, like it wasn't even out. So that's pretty interesting because this is like the level that they can actually target is through 0 days. Do they develop them themselves? Do they collaborate with other Chinese sponsored threat actors? We don't know, but we can probably speculate that they do. And in our case, yes, these are some of the domains that we have seen for the phishing domain. So we've seen the googleasia.com and this telegrams.icu. Who you want pay is, I think it's a Chinese service, financial service, and then Cloudflare. So they're all like typo squatted. And again, this slide does not contain part of the Trellix report where they detailed very well the initial access vector for phishing. So they've seen like a raw archive distributing that initial script, bash script. I think it was a little different, but the campaign is basically the same. And for execution, yeah, so Mandiant called SuperShell Go Reverse. I believe they're the same tool. It is a publicly available backdoor, and so is VShell. Although, again, VShell was taken off legitimately, but you can find it anywhere, basically. While we were trying to research our own way of VShell, like to understand what was changed, like from the actor to the original binary, we found many third parties where you could download VShell. So it's definitely still out there. So yeah, and it's possible to circumvent the configurations that were expired by the author to run it. So in terms of defense evasion, yeah, the main idea is definitely the fileless malware that we've seen. In this case, yeah, the MFD create system call, which again is not something that we have observed in our sandboxes or honeypots and research. It's not something that we have observed very much, basically. I think this was the first instance, really, where we've seen it like at such a large scale with a distribution vector and a network infrastructure. But I am aware that there have been a few reports now that it's being used for crypto mining. So yeah, in this case, we've also seen the WebSocket usage. Again, I think there are like a handful of reports that detail malware using WebSockets. It's not a very common protocol. So yeah, so far. Now we're going to be moving to the attribution challenge. So in this case, it's like, if somebody who is a nation state actor is using the same tools as someone who just wants to like mine cryptocurrency on your system, like how are you going to be able to tell the difference? Basically, it's very difficult because we believe this is on purpose, because it's to their advantage, like if you are not able to tell them apart, or if you don't have definitive proof that they are a nation state, well, your threat modeling strategies are going to be very different if you know that you're being targeted by a Chinese nation state or just, a script kiddie that wants to do crypto mining. So yeah, in this case, we definitely need more than indicators, although they are not completely useless. This is not, what the slide is about. They have to be complemented with behavioral indicators, and there's no getting around that because as we have seen, especially for the domains and the IOC, there are like network IOCs or even the fileless payload, like they're going to be very different if this attacker is financially resourceful and is able to change them like every few days. By the time they get deployed, like they're going to be obsolete already. So, in the way that we research this malware and the way we develop like rules through Falco, which is a detection engine, for Linux through system calls, and it's completely open source as well, is to look at the behavior, is to look at the system calls, like what is this malware actually doing once it's deployed, more than, where is it connecting to, because that may change, but, the behavior of the malware, it's not going to change as easily. It's not, every day that you develop a custom dropper that implements a custom fileless payload, and then you get flagged with your behavior, it's going to be way harder for an attacker to circumvent those type of IOCs. So yeah, so one thing I want to note is that WhoisXML API actually built off the IOCs that we've first seen for this threat actor. They did a pretty cool report on the network infrastructure only, where they basically found like, close to 200 connected domains and email addresses, 67 IP. Like basically this is not something, that you're going to be seeing a lot in terms of, if you don't have the financial resources to do this, then you just don't. It's not that easy for anyone to do this. And, in this case, again, shifting the focus from static indicators and network indicators alone to both static indicators, but behavioral patterns as well, is going to be helping you a lot in your strategy, in your defense strategy. And in this case, the deniability is, to their advantage. I think, Mandiant identified an individual that was basically state aligned, but in what sense are they state aligned? Like they're going to be basically also be a very useful asset to a hostile nation state, because in this case, they act as a third party. The state can say, well, they don't work for us, like they're their own thing. But obviously, they're compromising these systems and trying to resell them whenever they can. So in this case, this is going to be a challenge for threat modeling as well, because you're going to have to look at the incident and make a very quick response and quick strategy on how to react based like on a few indicators. And in this case, like based on an open source tool, like that's basically not something that can be done like on the fly to know whether you're being attacked by a nation state or, a low level technical actor. Basically, it's this idea, that if you start to use what everybody else is using, then you're kind of protected by the pool of cyber attackers that are using this. Of course, for different reasons, because we haven't really seen them use their tools for financial motives. We haven't seen them like trying to, deploy crypto mining or anything like this. And I don't believe that all the reports so far in this actor all point to the same idea, that they gain the access and they stay quiet. Like they don't try to exploit it for their own financial reasons. So, that's another thing. Usually on Linux systems, crypto mining is a big attack pattern that we see. So this was definitely really cool in the sense that it's not something that we've seen very often. So in this case, the context in which we find these open source tools is going to help us, because I put up a slide of the original, like a snippet of the original repo that hosted VShell. It was a pretty benign thing, and it was as is. Like it wasn't, distributed through a fileless custom payload. It was just hosted on GitHub. Anyone could use it for their own security reasons. Like, it definitely wasn't supposed to be abused the way it was. Yeah, so for us, this is a good indicator, because, when you're seeing like an attacker going the extra mile, trying to make their payload fileless, although it's like open source, like you have to distinguish that from someone who's just deploying VShell as is, right? And they have like an IP address that's not mapped to anything. That's basically going to be a good indicator for context in this case. And that's kind of true for all open source. We believe before VShell, they were using SuperShell. That's also hosted standalone. Like it's not injected in memory in a fileless way by a custom dropper. Basically, the context in which you find these executables running, although they are open source and they could be anyone, they can give you insights into what the capability of the attacker that you're dealing with is. For example, like VShell, that's the WebSocket protocol is not the default one. Most of the standalone malicious attackers that we've seen, they weren't using that. So clearly, that's another distinguishable artifact for the attacker, for this attacker. Yeah, so what can we do? Well, in our case, Falco, again, is an open source detection engine. You can deploy it, in all your systems or, in containers or something like this. It is very user-friendly in terms that you can do whatever you want with this detection engine. There are default rules, which are totally open source, but you can also build your own rules. So that's going to be working a lot for your environment, the open source version, and it is very good. It is an engine that can look, for example, at this behavior, fileless malware detected. What's it looking at? It's basically looking at any process that was executed from memory. You can flag that, you can make an alert, you can say, okay, if this happens, this is a critical thing, I want to know about it. And you can also do the same for what we said before, the huge chunks of memory that were reserved but not accessible. In this case, you can also make a rule for that. You can say, okay, I want to know when a program is mapping more than 64 megabytes of memory, and these memory pages are not accessible, because that's pretty strange in terms that if a fileless program does that, basically we were able to make a high severity rule out of this research, because it is not a very common behavior. And of course, there's also Yara. That's also an open source tool. If we go back a little bit, you can see here, I put in the string artifacts. These are artifacts that, you can use. In this case, maybe you wouldn't use the remote server, because that can change. But you could use, for example, the specially crafted GET request. That is not very, very common to be doing that with a specific user agent and then trying to find a specific log file on the system. So we were also able to make a Yara rule for that. And again, these are open source tool sets that can be used for you. I've also put the virus total query that we have used to see other instances of these actors. So we were looking at the file name, which in Linux, it's going to be looking like memfd deleted because it's like a non-existent memory file descriptor. And that is called kworker. And we were able to find quite a few executables like that. So virus total is, it also has a free version that can be used to do triaging and, trying to find like other infrastructure and connected patterns of distribution for executables. And of course, the IOC list expansion findings that Whois XML did, that was pretty good. I think you can download the report where they do have the IOC because again, it's not because IOCs are useless, it's because they can't do everything. Like if the attacker is able to set up 200 domains, like, you can't just, it's a cat and mouse race that we have to win also by complementing it with behavioral indicators. And in this case, these are free. Again, open source tools are not inherently bad. That's not what this talk is about. I hope it is clear. They are good, but they can be misused. And, we can use them to our advantage as well as defenders. So, yeah, I've also put some hunting that you could do. For example, T-Shark is another tool that is completely free. You can, for example, flag when a WebSocket is being used. You can look, for example, at, the header containing the WebSocket, or you can look, for example, at when DNS queries are being made on, if it's like in a remote server that you have an isolated server, like maybe could be weird. Not that DNS queries are weird inherently, but depending on where this is happening, it could be useful. And I've also put some general hunts. I believe you can do with like Elasticsearch, which I do think it's also has a free version, where, for example, if we've seen them used for VShell, like a non-standard port, in this case, for example, you want to flag a set of ports that, for you, they're disallowed, like they're not allowed to be used, or you don't use them very much. Like to know your environment and to make these type of queries and hunts, it could be useful to you and what makes sense for your environment. Or for example, we've seen them access those files that we said, like the access shadow on Linux and XA password, like those are pretty sensitive files. Like not everyone should be able to just access them. Or for example, some of these files, they're for environment fingerprinting. So for example, the UID map, it's gonna give you like a lot of information on, whether your root and capability you got and what are the mapping of your, user space process, which means like if you're in a sandbox or you're like on a host, if some of the configurations are more hardened, than normal, like it can give the attacker the ability to say, okay, this is a sandbox. I'm not gonna run. Like I know that this is not good for me. So yeah, another one is, for example, you wanna see for persistence hunt, you wanna see, okay, cron jobs, for example, executed by weird parents that are not like expected, Linux processes. Of course, this has to make sense for you, but I put some, threat hunting queries that could be helpful in regards to this type of campaign that we've observed. And yeah, so final recap. In this case, we've seen this threat actor, UNC5174, being able to develop their own custom malware and develop their own sophisticated use their own sophisticated technique, like a fileless payload, but still choosing to use an open source tool. And again, I want to reiterate, this is to their advantage because if you as a defender are not able to make sure that you're being targeted from a Chinese nation state or a low-level actor, like that's to their advantage because maybe you're going to be thinking this is an isolated security incident, but you're being targeted at scale. That's going to be good for them, basically. And the context is the key also to try to make an attribution of this kind, because as we've seen, the VShell binary, that was a standalone binary that was not made, in a custom dropper, that was not made in a fileless payload, that was distributed as is. So yeah, that's going to help you to make that distinction. And of course, for this reason, intelligence sharing is really good. Like, since we put out the report, I think I've seen 3 reports building off what we found. And this is a good thing because it really helps to expose these attackers when, security vendors collaborate and they put out and build off others' findings. We built off Mandiant what they found first. So, it's a continuous thing that we have to try to keep up with, because they're definitely, like, there are probably hundreds of other campaigns just like that, just as stealthy. But in this case, like, it's, we have to try to do our best. And in our case, defensive open source tools are effective. You are able to see with Yara, with Falco, like, these are good tools to try to flag malicious behavior. You may not always get, being targeted by a Chinese nation state, but it's definitely good to know that in case this happens, you do have some flagging happening on your system. You're not completely blind. So yeah, open source tools are not inherently malicious. They can be used for our advantage as well. So that's the key takeaway for this talk. And I want to do a little shout out to the SysDig open source community. It's a new community where, defenders, they can collaborate with other defenders, and you can find me in there too, basically, where this talk was advertised as well. It's a very cool thing to learn and to collaborate with other defenders. So please be sure to check it out. And that's that. If you have any questions.